Hi class. Today what we're going to do is we're going to continue talking about civil rights. And before I start, I just kind of want to give you an update on a few things. I'm going to do a lecture on sexual orientation today and one more lecture at the beginning of the week on sexual orientation, and that'll be it for the lectures. In regard to the last exam, I'm sending you a memo on that, and I'm trying to give the exam on either Saturday or Sunday, not of this week, but of next week. And it's going to just be identification. So like maybe say 15 out of 16 or 16 out of 17 identifications. And that'll be the last exam. In regard to the readings, I will also tell you what readings are responsible for, but obviously it's all the readings in regard to gender and sexual orientation. So today what I want to do is I want to talk about sexual orientation, and that's a new topic, and all I really want to do today is provide some definitions of what we mean by sexual orientation, then provide some context both historically and within the United States, some international context, then an overview of United States public opinion in regard to this issue of sexual orientation, and then just start this brief historical evolution, talk about this historical evolution of the idea of sexual orientation, show how it's changed over time. All right, so most of the material I'm going to talk about today comes right from Healy and O'Brien. So by way of introduction, the book defines sexual orientation for us. It says sexual orientation refers to the gender or genders to which a person is predominantly attracted. And by attracted, the book says we mean physically, emotionally, and affectionately. And based upon this definition, we develop three categories of sexual orientation. Heterosexual, which means people who are attracted to the opposite sex, and generally exclusively. Homosexual, which is defined as someone who is attracted to the same sex partner, and we generally subdivide that according to the book into two categories: lesbian, if it's a female attracted to a female, and gay, if it's a male attracted to a male. And then the last category is bisexual, which is an individual who is attracted to either gender, or to put it the other way, both genders. So those are the general kinds of ways where we define sexual orientation. Now, when we talk about sexual orientation, one of the questions that we generally ask and that a society deals with is, should the LGBT community be treated differently? And that is a question that divides many people in our society. Should they be treated differently? And when we say treated differently, we mean legally, religiously, socially. Should they be treated differently than the general population? And within this context, we want to talk a little bit about social attitudes and cultural attitudes towards sexual orientation. But let's just give an example of the kinds of things that have occurred in our society and how we've dealt with some of these issues over the last 10 years. So the book talks about Evelyn and Hope Johnson. So Evelyn and Hope Johnson were married in New York, which recognized same-sex marriage. But then they moved to North Carolina, which did not at that time recognize their marriage. And they lived together in North Carolina for 20 years. Hope gave birth to two children, Mariah and Paul. And again, Evelyn treated them as her children too. And then under North Carolina law, she attempted to adopt Mariah and Paul, but North Carolina prohibited her from adopting these children. And in fact, during this time, some of the teachers of these two children would not welcome both of the parents to the classroom events. They would only allow one to attend because they didn't want to show any approval for same-sex marital unions. Well, Evelyn Johnson gets into a car accident and she's in the hospital for several weeks in critical conditions. And the staff would not allow the children to visit Evelyn because they said that that was not her biological mother. So, in addition to that, Hope was not allowed to even visit Evelyn because they said that she was not considered family. And then, after Evelyn is in the hospital, Hope tries to get her insurance to help pay for some of the expenses under her family plan. And the family plan refuses to pay the expenses, again, saying that Evelyn was not her family. So as you can see, in the context of just this one example, there's significant legal, social, educational approaches that were taken to this that had a major impact on how they can live and enjoy their lives. And there's other cases like this. So, for example, in Utah, in 2015, April Hoagland and Becky Pierce got married, and they became foster parents. And they tried to adopt some children who they were the foster parents of. And what happens is a number of things. First, the Mormon Church barred the children from religious ceremonies because they said that married people of the same sex had no religious rights and would not be recognized in their church. And they refused to baptize the children. And then, after that, a Utah judge, Scott Johansson, ordered the foster child removed from their home because he said that they would be better off with a heterosexual parent. So clearly, what you can see is the laws, the ethics, the religious criteria that are applied to same-sex couples, to this whole idea of sexual orientation, can have major implications for the rights and obligations of these kinds of people. And we see the same thing in an international context. So let's look at some of the international examples of treatment of people based upon their sexual orientation. So according to the International Lesbian and Gay Association, over 2 billion people live in countries where homosexuality is a crime, and it's punishable by imprisonment, beatings, or other kinds of deprivations. So let's give some examples. Legislators in the Ukraine introduced a bill that made it a crime for producers of television shows to sympathetically depict homosexuals, so that these producers could be imprisoned for doing that. In Nigeria, people who directly or indirectly made a public show of same-sex relationship can go to prison for 10 years. In Iran, Saudi Arabia, the Sudan, and Yemen, anyone who is identified as a homosexual can be put to death. So clearly, the ramifications for sexual orientation throughout the globe is very significant. Well, what about the United States? Well, in the United States, we have very different perspectives, and they can vary from state to state and region to region. And they've changed significantly over time, but I mean, not that long ago, a gay college student in Wyoming was pistol whipped by fellow students, tied to a fence, and left to die. And then at this student's funeral, a church from Topeka, Kansas, held up signs saying, "God hates fags." Very significant event. But U.S. attitudes have evolved over time. So in the 1970s, over 75% of the public considered homosexual behavior to be always wrong. But this has changed. And in my time as a professor, this is probably one of the biggest changes in social attitudes I've seen among my students. So for example, we've been asking, the Pew Research Center has been asking questions about sexual orientation and same-sex marriage and support for same-sex marriage for years. And just to give you an example, in 2001, only 35% of the public favored same-sex marriage. By 2017, 62% of the public favored same-sex marriage. And there is a slight gender difference, but not that significant. Generally, women are more supportive of same-sex marriage than men. So again, to use the same kind of dates, in 2001, 32% of men favored same-sex marriage versus 38% of women. So it was favored by women by a little larger amount. By 2017, 60% of men versus 64% of women. So again, a slight gender difference. When we look at sexual orientation, many states do not provide significant non-discrimination protections based upon sexual orientation for employment and housing and many other kinds of issues. As a matter of fact, even by the year 2015, 16 states didn't have any legal protections based upon sexual orientation. In fact, many states, to the contrary, had what they referred to as religious restoration acts. Religious restoration acts. Now what's that? And when I say many states, 20 states have these. And what do? And matter of fact, Indiana passed this while Pence was governor, before he became vice president. What they do is they allow business owners to deny services to gays and lesbians if they say such actions can burden their religious beliefs. So in other words, if you don't want to provide any services to someone who is gay or a lesbian, all you have to say is doing so would violate my religious beliefs in these states. So that's just from a legal perspective. From a social perspective, we see that there is significant harassment of people based upon their sexual orientation. So we did some surveys of individuals who had a gay or lesbian sexual orientation, and we found the following kinds of things. 32% of them said they experienced some form of harassment. 20% of them said they feared for their physical safety because of their sexual orientation. 51% said that they concealed their sexual orientation to avoid intimidation. Among those whose sexual orientation were known, 89% said they experienced derogatory remarks. 39% said graffiti. 38% said they were pressured to remain silent about their identity. 15% said they received threats of physical violence. Over 10% said they were denied services. And about 5% said they were physically assaulted. So, regardless of the law, what we see is that sexual orientation has a major impact on how people are treated in society, in our society. All right, what I want to do now is talk about the cultural context for sexual orientation discrimination. In other words, how do we as a society respond to someone's sexual orientation? There can be different approaches to this, and we can kind of diagram this as a continuum. So, the least welcoming cultural context would be homophobia. The most welcoming is acculturation. And then there's a number of different gradations between those two extremes. So let's talk about these different social responses and what they mean. So as we said, the least accepting is this notion of homophobia. Homophobia is defined as hatred or fear of gays or lesbians. Prejudice, and it can be blatant or it can be subtle and indirect. Now, not quite as severe is this idea of structural heterosexism. So it'll be about here. Structural heterosexism. So what does that mean? Structural heterosexism refers to ways that heterosexual people receive receive people who are different than them. So for example, in the United States, the General Accounting Office has concluded that state laws and federal laws have denied more than 1,000 rights to same-sex couples. So from the federal level, things like Social Security benefits, tax deductions, medical insurance, medical protections, employment protections, all of these kinds of things. So that is specifically structural heterosexism. In other words, specifically denying certain rights and privileges based upon sexual orientation. Now, not quite as severe is cultural heterosexism. Cultural. So, when it's structural, it's being denied as a policy, as a law. When it's cultural, it's not being denied as a policy and law, but rather it's mores, ethical attitudes, perceptions. So it's an ideology that upholds heterosexuality as the norm and confers social acceptance based upon heterosexual relationships and social rejection based upon homosexual relationships. Then we have acceptance, which is more towards this side of the continuum. And acceptance can be either explicit or implicit actions which indicate that the dominant cultural group does not ostensibly disapprove of what they view as an alternative lifestyle. They accept it. Now, acceptance doesn't mean embracing it. It just means that, okay, we're not going to discriminate against you. We might not like it, but we're not going to discriminate against you. So the last approach, and the most accepting approach, is what we refer to as acculturation. Acculturation are efforts to actually include LGBT individuals in the dominant culture. So they're not seen as a counterculture. They're not seen as challenging any morality. They are instead embraced. So when you talk about acculturation, the main term that you use is embrace. Embrace. So those are the different kinds of orientations that you can have in regard to this whole idea. All right. The last thing I want to do today, to also again provide context for all of this, is look at the historical evolution of sexual orientation. Look at the background of same-sex relationships. Within this context, what we have to understand is that same-sex relations have existed and been written about throughout time, for thousands of years. But that a distinct social identity based upon sexual orientation, and even the word itself, homosexual, did not emerge until the later part of the 19th century. And that this disdain for this notion of homosexuality didn't come about until the late 19th century too. And we'll talk about that cultural opposition. But if we look at it from this broader historical context, what we can see is when you go back to ancient Greece, for example, in ancient Greece, relations between persons of the same sex were typically just one of many ways of exploring sexual orientation and sexual attraction. They were not seen as inappropriate. There were no policies or laws that forbid it. However, one of the things that we do know is there were norms for the socially appropriate ways that an older male could mentor a younger male. And these norms varied by social class and obviously the gender of the protege. So among the elite, it was acceptable for a young man to be, quote, wooed by an older man, and this could be seen as a sign of prestige. That an elite would want to woo this young man. Now why? Why was this prestigious? Well, first of all, you have to understand that historically at this time, thousands of years ago, for the most part, women were perceived as intellectually inferior, and men were socialized to expect little more from a woman than idle conversation with them. So rather, they were encouraged to take up strong emotional physical bonds and intellectual bonds with older men. And when they did court women, it was primarily for securing a wife with whom they could procreate. Remember, ancient Greece was a patriarchal society. The role of women was not exalted and in some ways was held really in contempt. Now, that doesn't mean women didn't have their own cultural perspective that also contributed to this idea of sexual orientation. So, while this was going on among the males of the society, we have some other interesting things going on in ancient Greece that dealt with Sappho. Sappho was an ancient Greek poet, woman, and in her writings, she indicated that erotic relationships between women were also common. And in response to the male-dominated society, Sappho established a women-oriented society on the Greek island, and you're not going to believe the name of this Greek island, the Greek island of Lesbos. Lesbos. Gee, I wonder what that term comes to mean later on. And that's where she ran a school for girls, where she encouraged their education. She encouraged them intellectually. And when the word lesbian was coined much later, it was attributed to Sappho's heritage. So women who desired an education pursued their studies in a sex-segregated environment, and it promoted emotional and physical bonds for them. Tried to explain that they were worthy citizens also. And Sappho would write about what life was like in this culture. She would write poetry describing these erotic feelings, showing that some same-sex relationships between women should not be seen as somehow deviant, but it was normal and acceptable. So that becomes the historically dominant approach. But it changes, and it changes dramatically. And it changes as our society goes from an agrarian to an industrial society to a modern society. And what we see is that these legal changes, these cultural changes, and these religious changes lead to a very different perspective on how we treat sexual orientation today. And next week we will give you the last lecture on sexual orientation.